Lesson 42, Two Americas. Why did poverty persist in the United States in an age of affluence? Lesson 42, Two Americas. Lesson 42, Two Americas. Lesson 42, Two Americas. Why did prosperity persist in the United States in an age of affluence? Introduction. Vice President Richard Nixon delivered a speech in September of 1956 predicting a prosperous next few years in the United States. He claimed that in the not-too-distant future, a 4-day work week would become the norm, and the remaining pockets of economic distress would be eliminated. These are not dreams or idle boasts, he stated confidently. Our hope is to double everyone's standard of living in 10 years. Nixon's optimism was not unique. Booming economic growth following World War II caused many government officials and leading intellectuals to believe that poverty would soon be eradicated. Although some people voiced concern that not all Americans shared in the post-war prosperity, most of the public ignored the existence of poverty in the United States. Time magazine went so far as to forecast the elimination of poverty as a fact of human life. In 1962, a book titled The Other America jolted the nation out of its complacency. Written by social activist Michael Harrington, the novel depicted two separate Americas, one affluent, the other impoverished. Harrington's book, which detailed how impoverished Americans lived and the extent to which poverty in the United States was rooted, appalled citizens and sparked a general wake-up call for the American people. The Other America generated a national discussion about the government's responsibility to address gross inequalities in American society. Michael Harrington, Other America. Michael Harrington, The Other America. Michael Harrington was a social and political activist who is best known for writing The Other America. This book stunned readers with its portrayal of poverty in the midst of American affluence. In the 1960s, it helped to inspire the government anti-poverty program called the War on Poverty. The persistence of poverty in an affluent society. Two Americas existed side by side in towns across the country, including Greenwood, Mississippi, where the playwright Endesha Ida Mae Holland grew up in the 1950s. Holland later wrote a memoir about her childhood. Raised by a hardworking single mother alongside 3 siblings, she described the contrast between poverty and prosperity in Greenwood. The well-to-do whites, she wrote, lived on quiet, shady boulevards and houses with many big rooms and bright, soft rugs on the floors. Each house had a neatly trimmed lawn with pretty flowers set in borders along the walkway. In these neighborhoods, the streets were paved and no open window was without its screen. In contrast, Holland's family lived in the respectable black section of town. Her home was a small, ramshackle house infested with cockroaches. The roof leaked, the walls were plastered with newspaper, and packed earth was visible between the floorboards. Holland was poor, but others were poorer. She wrote that the poorest black people lived near the railroad tracks, where in places the tracks were almost hidden by the smelly black mud that oozed from the bayou and open cesspool that held the waste from the outhouses. Different ways of defining poverty. Most people understand the concept of poverty as a lack of means, money, material goods, or other resources to live decently. But what does it mean to live decently? There has never been a single standard for measuring economic deprivation, and what people consider to be poor depends on where and when they live. For much of American history, many Americans believed that poverty was equally a moral condition and an economic one. They scorned poor people who did not work and lived on public charity, called paupers. Many viewed pauperism, or dependency on public assistance, as a moral failing. Pauperism is the consequence of willful error, wrote a leading clergyman in 1834, of shame, of indolence, laziness, of vicious habit. But Americans recognized that poverty could result from misfortune, believing that people who were unable to work, including the elderly, the disabled, and children, could not help being poor. Many Americans also realized that most poor people did work, but their wages were too low to liberate them from poverty. Known as the working poor, these Americans were once referred to as the poorer sort. Although working people were afforded more respect by society than paupers, there was little difference between the two types economically. In the late 1800s, social scientists began to examine poverty more objectively, viewing it in economic rather than moral terms. They defined poverty as a lack of income for the first time and created the term poverty line to refer to the minimum amount of income one needs to meet basic needs. However, scholars disagreed about exactly where to draw the poverty line. In 1949, the Subcommittee on Low-Income Families proposed a poverty line of $2,000 per year for families of all sizes. This unofficial line was commonly used until 1958, when the government began adjusting the line based on the family size. An official poverty line was determined in 1965 and was calculated by tripling the minimum food costs for a family, since food generally comprised about one-third of a family's total budget. The poor in post-war America, an invisible class. By the end of the 1950s, approximately 1 in 4 Americans lived below the poverty line. No! According to the Other America, this meant that about 50 million people were suffering an inadequate quality of life. Middle-class readers of Michael Harrington's book were shocked to discover the extent of the country's poverty. How could they not have noticed such widespread misery? To justify their lack of perception, Harrington cited American poverty's ability to camouflage. Where the poor lived, what they wore, how old they were, helped to obscure them from affluent Americans. Harrington conceded that the exodus of middle-class families to the suburbs after World War II in part accounted for the general lack of knowledge about poor Americans. Middle-class workers commuting to urban business districts seldom encountered poor people living in old city neighborhoods. Harrington suggested that commuting workers easily overlooked the destitution in cities and imagined that most Americans lived comfortably. The availability of inexpensive clothing also helped hide signs of poverty. Even though poor people's clothes may have looked better than most people would assume, they still had a relatively substandard lifestyle. Age was another factor that camouflaged poverty. Harrington noted that over 8 million poor were 65 years old or older, and even more were younger than 18 years old. Elderly people seldom strayed from their rented rooms or homes in older urban neighborhoods, and their lack of mobility furthered people's ignorance. While young people attracted more attention, they too rarely ventured outside their hometowns. In addition, the poor wielded no political power, making it easy for others to ignore them. Harrington recognized that many poor people were not involved in unions, fraternal organizations, or political parties. They were also not involved in lobbying campaigns or with creating legislation. The landscape of poverty in a land of plenty. The poor, Other America, had no geographic or cultural boundaries. It included cities and rural areas in every state, and its inhabitants belonged to every racial, ethnic, and age group in the country. In 1959, more than 1/4 of the nation's poor were children, and 1/3 were elderly. In a decade marked by prosperity, how did so many get left behind in the inner city? In the 1950s, poor people moved to cities as middle-class whites left for the suburbs. From 1945 to 1960, about 5 million African Americans migrated to northern cities from the South. By 1955, nearly 700,000 Puerto Ricans had moved to the mainland, mostly to New York City. In the West, numerous Mexican immigrants moved to Los Angeles and other cities. Many of these new arrivals moved in search of manufacturing jobs, but as industries relocated to the suburbs, city jobs disappeared. Housing discrimination also limited where minorities could live and work. One Puerto Rican living in Philadelphia recalled, "When I went to look for apartments, they throw the door in my face. They don't want no colored people. You know, my skin is dark." Black and Latino populations concentrated in decaying inner city areas that were being abandoned by whites. These blighted neighborhoods became overcrowded slums with high rates of poverty and unemployment. To rectify this problem, Congress passed the Housing Act of 1949, which aimed to produce a decent home for every American family by funding public housing and urban renewal programs. The government demolished numerous slums with urban renewal funding, replacing them with high-rise apartments, offices, and civic buildings. Despite its lofty goal, the Housing Act of 1949 augmented urban poverty. Hundreds of thousands of poor people lost their homes when their neighborhoods were bulldozed. Although low-income public housing projects were intended to provide an alternative, not enough housing was built to accommodate the displaced homeowners. So the overcrowded and impoverished projects became the new slums in many cities. Trying to live off the land, American farmers also faced poverty. Post-World War II, agriculture Agricultural innovations contributed to the growth of agribusiness, or the industry of food production by large corporations or wealthy individuals. Agribusiness holdings were vast in size and efficiently produced large quantities of food by applying industrial production techniques to farming. Agribusiness was profitable at the expense of the rural poor because small farms could not compete with giant corporate farms, so many sank into poverty. As a result, thousands of rural poor whites and blacks moved from the rural areas to cities in search of work. On large corporate farms, migrant workers endured low pay and wretched living conditions. Many were Mexican braceros who came to the United States between 1942 and 1964, while others entered illegally. In 1954, the government implemented the Operation Wetback to expel undocumented immigrants, under which officials seized and deported several million Mexicans. Of the Mexican immigrants remaining in the United States in the 1950s, 1 in 3 lived below the poverty line. One large corporate farm endured low pay, wretched living conditions. Many were Mexican braceros who came to the United States between 1942 and 1964, while others entered illegally. In 1954, the government implemented Operation Wetback to expel undocumented Mexican immigrants, under which officials seized and deported several million Mexicans. Of the Mexican immigrants remaining in the United States in the 1950s, 1 in 3 lived below the poverty line. Appalachia, a mountainous region in the south, was another rural outpost of poverty. Due to the area's steep terrain, farming the land was difficult. When demand for coal decreased after World War II, coal mining, the region's once dominant industry, declined as a result. The decrease in demand for coal, combined with mining mechanization, eliminated mining jobs. In the 1950s, more than 2 million impoverished Americans left Appalachia. Harrington described those who remained as a beaten people, sunk into their poverty and deprived of hope. America's poorest citizens. Perhaps the poorest U.S. citizens were American Indians. A 1949 study of conditions on American Indian reservations found hopeless poverty and slum squalor. Indeed, people living on reservations seemed the most invisible poor of all. To the degree that Michael Harrington omitted them quite wrongly, he later wrote, "From The Other America, the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 had affirmed American Indians' right to govern themselves and their status as wards of the federal government. Therefore, the government was responsible for protecting their lands and providing them economic aid and social services. After World War II, the government wanted to terminate this relationship. Practically getting out of the Indian business would save money, and many people believed releasing American Indians from federal supervision would enable them to assimilate and become more economically self-reliant. Their slogan demanded self-sufficiency and thus would be vulnerable to exploitation. They feared that the tribes would be freed of the few assets, mainly land, they still possessed. In 1953, Congress voted to eliminate the federal government's responsibility for American Indians. This termination policy ended federal aid to tribes, withdrew federal land protection, and distributed tribal land among individuals. The following voluntary relocation program encouraged American Indians to move to cities, providing transportation and initial assistance to finding housing and jobs. Approximately 30% of American Indians lived in urban areas by 1960, but many who relocated struggled to adapt to city life. More than 100 American Indian tribes and bands were eventually terminated. Without economic aid, their poverty worsened. Destitute tribes were forced to sell their land, resulting in the loss of over 1 million acres. Termination eventually proved a failure, and the policy was abandoned in 1963. Michael Harrington's The Other America revealed that despite general affluence of the 1950s, millions of socially invisible Americans lived in poverty. Although people's views and understanding of poverty had changed over time, the problem persists. Defining poverty: invisible class, urban poverty, rural poverty, the American Indian policy.